to the Way Christian School, who gave us a lovely introduction with their voices. My name is Gillian Fleischmann. I'm the curatorial assistant here at the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗶. And today I am joined from my left, furthest to the left. I'll start with the ladies. Puleng Plessie, who is our curator of education and public programs here at the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗶. We also have Motsane Seabela, who is the acting director and the curator of anthropology at the 𝗙𝗃 National Museum of Cultural History. And last but not least, we have Stephen Sack, who is the managing director of the Cape Town Science Centre. Thank you. Yes. We are gathered here today to commemorate what happened on the 21st of March in 1960. So what happened, it's known as the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 massacre, where 69 protesters were shot by the apartheid police when they were protesting against the pass laws, which is the reason why we celebrate, or rather commemorate Human Rights Day. It's to think of the lives that people have sacrificed for our freedom, and so that we can all be here together in one room. And behind us, we have a very monumental sculpture by Mam Noria Mabasa, which commemorates a significant event, which is quite similar to the motive behind what happened prior to the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 massacre, where in 1956, about 20,000 women from all around the country gathered together and marched to the union buildings here in Pretoria, also in protest against the pass laws. And I think it's quite a significant sculpture, which is as monumental as the march in itself. And just to give a brief history of Mam Noria Mabasa, she was born in 1938, and she's mostly known for her pottery and wooden sculptures. And she began practicing in the 1970s. And her work is mostly inspired by her dreams, but it speaks to moments of everyday life, mythology, and spirituality. And her works also form part of a number of collections in institutions. And she recently received an honorary doctorate from the University of Johannesburg in 2023. So today we are here with very important museum or institutional professionals who have in some way or another interacted with the practice of Mam Noria Mabasa. So just to start off, I think it would be wonderful to hear from each of you. When was your first encounter or memory with Mam Noria Mabasa's practice? And yeah, a memory that stayed with you. Thank you.
No, you can start.
Hello? Is it off? Is it audible? Thank you. 𝗏𝗏𝘃𝗶𝗶. My first encounter was in 2008, and what I can think of when I actually first heard about her was in 2008 during my internship. I had just been appointed for the internship at the same museum I'm at now, and we were just it was an orientation of the building and the staff, and we were taken to this space. They still call it 𝗏𝗏𝘃𝗶𝗶, or we still call it the 𝗏𝗏𝘃 exhibition, and we were told that we will go through the 𝗏𝗏𝘃𝗶𝗶 exhibition, and it was incomplete at the time, still is today. It's an amazing space, and I hope by the time I leave that institution, it will be completed. But then this is where I came across the sculpture that is behind us, and it wasn't when they talked about her, it was like, okay, this is a Noria Mabasa sculpture, and it's from we've studied, it's from the Department of Arts and Culture, and then that was it, lights off, and then we left the space, and then, well, it stayed in there for many years. I left the institution, and then I went back some years later in 2014, and because I was in anthropology, and you were told that, you should stay in your lane. This belongs to art, and this is anthropology. So for so many years, it was just staying in there, and I didn't have any other interaction with the space or the sculpture until I started my journey, my PhD journey in 2021. And then because it's always been bugging me. I've always had this bugging feeling that we are continuously marginalizing these stories, the people, because museums are not just about stories, but they are about the people first. So we are continuously marginalizing her as an artist, as a person, as a woman. And then Javet, when was it? Was it last year? Early last year, then spoke to us and reached out about the We the People exhibition, and yeah, then we started talking about it, and I think Puleng, you can speak about yours. I think I'll then speak about a lot of other stuff of how it started when Gillian starts with questions.
No, you can give it to me. I'll show you after my book.
Oh, okay.
Testing. I'm actually going to stand up because I want to be able to see all your faces. Good morning, everyone, and lovely to be here with you in this fabulous art gallery here. You know that an institution is really good when the bathrooms are immaculate and clean. Test the bathrooms. Sure. 1985 is when I first met Noria. She came to stay in my house. we were living in Crown Mines. It was a very, very, probably the most important exhibition that was done, called the Tributaries exhibition in 1985. It was curated by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. And it was the first time there was like a cutting edge contemporary exhibition that was put into the old, what is now Museum Africa. So it was like that new feel when you have contemporary art in an industrial building. And so there was this major exhibition, and they brought artists for the first time, many artists from what we then called Venda. Just remember, this is during apartheid. And so you had Jackson Hlungwane and Nelson Makuba and Phuthuma Siyoko, and Noria was on the exhibition. And it was probably one of the first times that Noria had been to Johannesburg. And of course, she spoke no English, and she still doesn't speak very much English. And she stayed in our home. And that's when I first met her. And then the story will unfold about my opportunities to work with her, because although I work at the Cape Town Science Centre now, my background is actually in arts and culture. From 1997, I was in the National Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology. Now that was a good place for arts and culture, to be alongside science and technology, because there's such a deep history of artists and scientists throughout the ages working everywhere, in Africa, in Europe, working together. So when I was in that ministry, the minister put me on the board of the Cape Town Science Centre because he wanted there to be an interaction between art and science. And now later in life, I've gone back there just to help. It's 25 years old, and to manage it. And we're doing a very exciting new art and science program. I look forward to sharing more of the stories about Noria as we began. Thanks.
Thank you. I have quite an interesting story. Funny thing is that my encounter with Noria Mabasa, my first memory was actually not within the arts, but through my mother. She was working with a group of people from Limpopo for a game reserve, a project for a game reserve that was Ben Lavin. It was a Ben Lavin reserve. Now this reserve was obviously belonged to the Manavelas, and my mom had this amazing project of trying to give it back to the Manavelas. So my first encounter was not only the process of trying to bring the land back to the Manavelas, but also trying to renovate the game reserve. So that included making sure that there are artworks from the local communities that could exhibit, not really exhibit, but be there. So my first encounter was in a beautiful meeting that they had. I was obviously there around the same time, Motsane. It was around like 2007 for me. 2008-09 for me as well. And there was Thomas Kubai, there was Jackson Hlungwane, all the people we hear about in school. So that was the very first time I actually heard or saw of her. So I saw her as a person, and then she introduced her work. So that was my first encounter with her, and I cherish that moment because it's outside of the arts, and yeah.
I think it's a really beautiful opening ground to also hear the different ways and different, due to lack of a better term, the different narratives in how each and every single person has encountered her practice. Stephen, I'll start with you. I guess since you encountered her practice earlier on, I'm very interested, and if you could please explain to us the art environment in South Africa around that time. I know there are themes of monumentalism, you know, in the work. And I'm very curious, and to also add on, I am aware that you had approached her to commission a monument that's currently in the Union buildings, which is quite sad because currently the Union buildings are actually gated and people can't freely access the gardens anymore, which is something that happened quite recently. But yeah, I'm very curious if you could please share with us that moment. Thank you.
So, let me just... This catalogue is an exhibition called The Neglected Tradition, which was curated by a team of us at the Johannesburg Art Gallery in 1988. So that was the first time that I was part of a team that curated Noria into the first attempt at a history of Black South African art, but a history that was inclusive, that showed how Black artists and white artists, urban artists and rural artists, schooled artists and untrained artists all evolved. And just a very important thing, because when we get to Noria, is to understand the process of modernization and the way in which art enters a marketplace. And it starts to happen in the 1930s, and it starts to happen in the agricultural fairs. Because just remember, if you're living in a rural community and you're working in crafts or you're doing clay figurines or something, where are you going to sell them? And the opportunity was through the agricultural fairs that the first work started to be sold. So if you look at the very earliest work that Noria does, the first agency for it is tourism. There was a very, very successful tourism office in 𝗏𝗏 and a very dynamic woman, and I'll remember her name because she was very important, who ran a gallery in their tourism office in 𝗏𝗏. And so that's where the artists entered the market, through the door of the tourism industry. And then from there, the work moved into the gallery system and worked into the homes of private collectors. And one of the very important things about Limpopo was that the collectors who acquired the early work were very serious collectors. So there are many works that were acquired by these early collectors and were cared for and then found their way ultimately into the academy and into the museum system. So jump ahead, 1997, I joined the National Department of Arts and Culture, and in 2000 we get this instruction to do the first monument in the new democratic order, the first monument commissioned by the South African government, Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology. And so it fell on my desk to coordinate this project. Bridget Mabanda was the minister, so because she was the woman deputy minister, she took charge of the project. We worked very closely with her, and we had a committee of people who were going to make the selection for the commission. Now, me and a friend of mine, we'd both studied fine art at Wits. We knew the art scene. We knew who the artists were, who we should invite to do this commission. And Noria was on the top of the list, but we weren't allowed to approach the artists. We had to run a transparent, open process and put out a tender and invite submissions, which we did. And we got lots and lots of very didactic, you know, the raised fists and the chains and all of the obvious symbols. And we had been to see Noria, because we wanted Noria to submit a work. So we went up to Venda, to Limpopo, to visit her, to her village, and to tell her about the commission. And we departed, and she said to us, she will dream the piece and she will be in touch with us, okay? So we go back to Pretoria, all the submissions come in, deadline, no submission from Noria. She hasn't dreamt the piece. So we commission the piece, and there's an article which they have a copy of it. You should read it. It's my description of what happened on the day, because it was quite an extraordinary moment. You know, the piece they commissioned had all sorts of problems around it, but let's not dwell on that. Let's talk about Noria. Then 2 years later, so around 2002, I get a phone call from 𝗏𝗏. She says, I want to send you a photograph. Noria has made her woman's monument. And she sends me the photograph of this piece of sculpture that Noria had dreamt and that she had made. And it sits in the Union buildings. And I found a photograph of it, which did I share it with you? Which is in I'll find it and I'll send it to you. So it's not nearly as big as this. And it's just, you know, the exciting thing about the work that one does in curating is that you'll do a huge research project and there's a single issue or a single question that arises as the absolutely central question that you're grappling with. And I realized, I mean, and thank you for inviting me, because this thing has opened my eyes to a whole new realization of what's going on. If you're going to make a monument, you can't dream a monument into existence out of nothing. If you're memorializing a particular event, you've got to do some research. You need photographs of the event. You need written accounts of the event. Noria's living in a village out in Limpopo. There's no source material. When we went to see her, she didn't have any source material to know about the Women's March. So it's extraordinary that the piece that she made is about the drum. Now, I don't know if you guys know the story of the Venda drum. What is that drum called? Do you remember what it's called?
Yeah.
No, not the Domba drum. Although it's used in the Domba. It is used in the Domba. So this drum, there's one in Freedom Park with the story about the drum. The drum was never allowed to rest on the ground. Okay, it had to always be carried and elevated off the ground. The other story is that this drum was carried across Africa from the Holy Land, that it's kind of the equivalent of a tabernacle, you know, that would keep the scrolls in the Judaic tradition. That's this drum. So the drum is what she uses, what comes up in her dream to symbolize this event. And I don't know if the correlation then, of course, the Domba drum to the Domba, to women initiation. You have the Maropa drum with the Sutus, which is a clay drum played by women. So there are drums that are played by women. So there's just like a whole area of research about the nature of a sculpture that comes out of a dream versus a sculpture that comes out of, because this now is different. Here, this piece, it would have been made later on, and you can see it's got the dompas strewn about. You know what the dompas, does everybody know what a dompas is? Everybody's shaking their, okay. So the old passbook that your parents had to carry, your grandparents, I hope, not your parents, shows the dompas. It's got the names of the people. It's capturing the moment. You can see that there's been a different kind of research that's happened. And the making process, so one of the things, last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll come to other issues. Noria's living in a village where and there's a river at the bottom of her home where she lives. The big trees that have died, often the wood gets washed down the river, and then there'd be this great, beautiful chunk of natural wood that she would then pull onto her property, and she'd live with this piece of wood. And the natural forms in the wood, You know this notion that wood has a soul, and that the image is in the wood and the artist unlocks it from the wood, okay? She would see these patterns in the wood and dream about them, and then the sculpture would evolve out of the wood. Whereas for this, she had to find a piece of wood that's almost like a canvas. It's a great blank canvas into which she could then populate the heads and the figures and the presence of the crowd. So you can see that as she develops, you can compare her. There's a very important sculptor from the region called 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏. 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 was trained as a cabinet maker. So when 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 makes his sculpture, he assembles the wood into a block. Are any of you art students or sculpture students? You know how you make a piece of sculpture out of a block? Draw the front, draw the profile, and then carve it out. That's how 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 works. Whereas with Noria, she's working with natural forms. And you know, you'll see in a tree, oh, look, there's a snake. Oh, look, there's a woman's torso. Oh, look, there's a face in the pattern of the wood. So you get those two different ways of working. So lovely to, yeah, we can engage with this more. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Motsane, I just want to come to you in terms of what you touched on earlier in your introduction, or rather your first encounter with Noria's practice. You also mentioned this tendency and a sense of marginalization that happens in institutions. But mostly I feel as a curator, cultural worker who works in a museum institution where the ethos of the institution is to preserve history over time. I guess it's a twofold question. So the first part I've addressed. And then the second part is this nature of museums conserving and this sense of conservation. I don't know if it's intentional or non-intentional. It tends to restrict public access, you know, from seeing these beautiful and historical artworks, such as the one behind us. Yes.
Yeah, you know, being a curator, a museum worker, one always grapples with questions around why we're preserving, for whom, and you know, in the missions and the visions, you always have phrases like, yeah, we are preserving for future generation, but who is the future generation? Who said the future generation, whoever that future generation is, wants to see this in that future, and particularly museums that are such as the 𝗔𝗏 Museums of South Africa. While I'm based at the 𝗔𝗏 National Museum of Cultural History, it is under the 8 museums under 𝗔𝗏 Museums of South Africa, which was founded on colonization because it was established in 1892. So the way in which the so-called objects that I'm always uncomfortable using, you know, people were just hoarding. It was just to hoard, and it didn't matter whether whoever they went to, particularly with the ethnographic collections, because it's mainly Black people and communities that which were colonized, because I'm curating collecting or objects from Africa, Oceania, and Asia. So you find it's around 25,000. So you find all from colonial or the former colonies. We can say we are in the post-colony, but we know that all these remnants of colonization are still within us. But the issue of preservation and, like you're saying, conservation, and how it always marginalized, someone will be marginalized. And when Stephen, you were talking about the Union Buildings monument, and you also mentioned that I also encountered this marginalization, because in my PhD, I was looking at how women are marginalized in the memory and heritage of the liberation of or struggle of South Africa. And the issue of access is not just in the museums, but even in all these spaces that are supposedly to be public, because a monument is they say it's a public monument, but it's within the Union Buildings. You have to go this process. I couldn't even get to the monument, because I mean, just when I got there, and then you have the police who are saying, okay, you need to go. This is not open to the public, but we are told that it's a public monument dedicated to women. And that is similar to the monument that is on what is called the 𝘠𝘠𝘦 Square now, along the former, what is this taxi with lots of the street, 𝗏𝗏𝗏. Now it's 𝘠𝘠𝘦. That too is supposedly open to the public. That was officially opened in 2015, but 2015, so 10 years later, we still don't have access to it. It's still being maintained. When it was established, it was to commemorate the same women, your 𝘠𝘠𝘦, your Sophie de Bruyn, and others. So it's actually not just in museums, but in museums, it's almost scary in how museum workers are so obsessed with wanting to hold on to these things that we found there. They do not belong to us. They belong to whoever that made them. But museums and the issue that our legislation too contributes to this marginalization, whether it's the National Heritage Act or the now National Policy on Restitution and Repatriation, the 2023, that too contributes to this marginalization, because we are told that you have to preserve for future generation. But what about this generation that's here? So museums thrives on marginalizations and silencing, and through this sculpture, we were, although I regard myself as because I do not conform to museum practices, and I refuse, and I feel that instead of being outside and saying I'm anti-museums, it's best to be within and deal with these injustices from within. And this piece is one of those pieces that are forcing us as museums to account for these injustices. It's putting to bear the fact that, I mean, this was in storage for over 10 years in the dark, because the lights in there are not even working. So it was only, I don't even know, probably the sculpture would have been seen not even 5 times a year, because it's not within a specific collection. It's not within the art collection, but it was just sitting in the dark. And what's also interesting about this, it's how it was stored. In that it wasn't so. When it was transferred after the arts and culture, as Stephen has mentioned, after they bought it in 2002, and then it stayed a bit at the union buildings. So when it was brought to 𝗔𝘃, and that too, there's still this gaps of exactly when it came to 𝗔𝘃. But what we know for sure now is that in 2010 it was there, because we went through our archives. So by going through some of them, we actually found this in quarterly reports from the director's quarterly reports, where there is reports on conservation work while it was being prepared for an exhibition in Senegal in December 2010. So, but there are these silences, and by the way in which it was stored, kept away from the public, it was just this perpetuating the silences and just marginalizing not just the artists but the stories, and contributing to this the attempted murders and erasures. When I was coming this morning here, I was listening to Power FM, and they were discussing the 𝗙𝗵𝗃 massacre, and they were speaking about when you started, you spoke about the 69 that were killed, and that's the number that we know about. But at this point, from the archives have revealed that at least 93 people were killed on the day, and others, many more that were injured, is not the number that we know about. And this archive, that which too is a form of, well, it's similar to museums. It thrives on marginalizing. It thrives on the silences that you had kept this information, because it's within the South African Police archives. The general public would not have access to it. People have lost their parents, their siblings, and they didn't know. They were just missing. They were still missing 6 years later. So, and I'm going back to this sculpture and how it was then forcing us to account. Is that when we started the discussion with 𝗙𝗵𝗃, and I suggested that one of the pieces that then would tell the story of 𝗙𝗏 would be this art piece. So how it was stored is that it was put in that space, then drywall walls built around it. So the drywall came into being once it was in there, but it was made in a way that it was never going to leave that space because of its height. And so the intention, and when you read how it was stored, then it was meant to stay in there and probably decay at some point. It was just kept to die, for death. So when we then had to remove it from that space, it still represented what the 1956 Women March was about. It was still a form of resistance, and the fact that, because this is untreated wood, it's organic, and dust was on it. No one was checking on what was happening to it. So it has demonstrated different forms of resistance in that it resisted whatever conservation practices or the right way, the standards, which I also don't conform to, because they are prescribed Western standards, which a lot of times do not even, they're not even, we don't relate to, because we are in Africa and we have been denied to embrace our ways of conserving. But the way in which we were then forced to open up whatever accessibility that we have been and always are preaching about as museums, to say it's a public institution, there's accessibility which is exclusive because it's exclusive. What the space that is for the public is the gallery, and that contains like 1% of the over 2 million that the cultural history and just the cultural history museum has. But for the rest of the 99%, the general public does not get to interact with it. Thank you.
Thank you. From what you've said, it reminded me of the saying of when an artwork gets acquired into a museum, that's when it dies, which is quite ironic, because mostly artists gain provenance through their works being acquired by, provenance museum institutions. And it's also interesting on how you highlight how multiple narratives are quite important in understanding, the full story, where I believe spaces such as these, museum spaces, galleries, the internet, for instance, allows those, multiplicity, or lays ground for multiple narratives. But speaking to this idea of preserving and keeping away, I'm going to link this to Puleng. So Puleng is an arts educator, and she also works in a curatorial space. And what I've seen is textbooks, for instance. I mean, it's also one of the reasons why we have invited, the art students as well to be here, is that, artworks, for instance, Noria Mabasa, for one, is included in the curriculum as well. So even though the sculptures are not necessarily accessible to the public, learners can access them, through textbooks, which is sad because they cannot always access them physically, maybe to see the impact, the vastness, because artworks also have an aura, seeing it on a piece of paper, and sometimes textbooks are usually in black and white, they're not always in color. Back to my question, yes, it's mostly what goes into consideration when, who decides, what are the powers that govern which artist and which artwork gets included into a textbook?
Sure, okay. So, yeah, the higher government structures actually put that in place. But I think what goes into consideration in terms of that is thinking about the history, but also thinking about the phases. So if I can take you back, visual arts is actually really taught in grade 10, from 10 to 12. So before then it's creative art, and then it's mixed with LO, you know, but in grade 10 FET stage, that's when we really start to think about South African history and themes that go with that. So for instance, if one could look at between 10 and 12, there's this theme around heritage. So one could use 𝗔𝗔 Mahlangu, for example, to think about what heritage is, what does it mean for women artists to work in a space that speaks to her heritage, right? Then we've also got themes such as gender, you know, which really, we've got 𝗔𝘩𝘗𝘁𝑭𝘭 here as well. They have artists that speak to this idea of gender. And then we also have, for instance, protest and resistance. And there you have your social political artists that speak to apartheid, of course. They speak to South Africa's political era through social commentary or political commentary. And then we also have, for instance, and I think this is my last example, and I'm getting to where I'm getting to. Then we have something we call urban and rural artists. So here, then they unpack 𝗛𝘩𝘃𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗀, Mam 𝗛𝗃𝗶𝗶𝗀𝘃𝗊𝑒𝑛 𝗂𝑐𝐵𝑑𝑒, you know. So what I like about that is that it's not only South African based, but when you think about Noria Mabasa, what happens there is that she is not limited to either one of those structures. So she is, yes, in the gendered way of thinking about our society. She's also in the political and social commentary, but she's also in the heritage and the rural, right? So what teachers then do, how the learners then engage is, there are structures put in place by government, but the teacher therefore can use the textbook that gives you an idea of what, you know, the artists that speak to this, or they can also navigate spaces and contemporary artists that speak to something like this. So it's interesting how, I'm going to use this artwork behind me as a very good example. Yes, she's from the rural community. Yes, she's speaking about herself, but she's also speaking about 1956 as a woman artist, thinking about a political time in South African history. So, yeah, so how the teacher would therefore do it, and I keep looking at you, and thank you for being here again, is they really try to navigate the curriculum. So as much as I curate educational programs, teachers have got this beautiful way of curating their educational content in the classroom. So they get to choose which artist speaks to this and which artist speaks to that, that engages the students in much more ways than schools that do or do not have access to arts education the way they should, you know? So I think that's another layer on its own, and it wouldn't be answering your question, but I hope I answered your question.
It does touch on it. Since we are still on the educational theme, I think it would be nice to ask a follow-up, because we are addressing, you know, you being this person, individual, who mitigates or mediates this intersectionality of education, of art, of museum practice.
Right.
And like Motsane mentioned earlier, you know, when you work in certain spaces, you are aware of the advantages and the disadvantages as well. So within this intersectionality, what moment have you found most profound for you?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So what I found really profound is, again, the artwork behind us. And I think I can understand why you mentioned that actually this is not the artwork, and you mentioned a picture. So in the curriculum, in the top class textbook, grade 8 top class textbook, it has union buildings Noria Mabasa's information. It unpacks, of course, the history of 1956. It even gives little glossaries about what is a 𝗏𝗀𝗃, you know, what is this and that. But the problem with that is that this is the incorrect artwork. The work that they put in the textbook is not this artwork. And I can see why you also said, hold on, this is not the work I thought it was. So it's interesting that you say there are advantages and disadvantages. And I think the disadvantage would therefore be learners learning about an artwork and its historical content, but learning about the incorrect artwork. So yeah, that's something I find very, very interesting. I actually had the picture here and I wanted to show you, and like, is this the work you were talking about? Because what that does is that it allows the learners to unpack a work that doesn't speak to what it's supposed to speak to, right? It's like saying you take a work from Mam Noria Mabasa and say, unpack it as 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃's work, you know, it's yeah. So while there are advantages in terms of the accessibility sometimes, but there's also the disadvantage of incorrect information. And I'm gonna take it a step back when actually and tap into my curatorial pedagogy moment where in my learning process as well, I don't learn on my own, I also learn in my process. There's an artwork upstairs titled Education Unrest, .. ellipsis, and then it says a never-ending story. Now this artwork shows 1976. Women, well, at first I didn't know it was a girl child, but they're all wearing the black, you know, the black tunic, you know, the one that Sarafina one. They're all wearing that, but it's very interesting because that title is very important in terms of where we are today, thinking about, you know, fees must fall, thinking about the Bella Bill and language, thinking about Afrikaans must fall, you know, how these conversations around language are still prominent today. However, I learned from a colleague of mine, our collections registrar, got it right, collections registrar, 𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏, who actually pointed out that the title is incorrect. So the title is actually, say no to the slave language. Yeah, say no to the slave language. Now, I'm getting to my point, sorry. Now, the problem here is not only, and you mentioned marginalization, and I want to get back to this point. The problem now is that we are not only thinking about giving incorrect artworks in textbooks, which therefore give incorrect information about the Black artist. We are also in our exhibition spaces, in our museum spaces, giving information. It's not, yeah, it is. I don't know how to put it because we are given a particular title, but it also like literally written. The artist literally wrote there, no to the slave language. And we chose to put our own title, which kind of deviates from what the artist is trying to say. So now, while speaking to this idea of education, Gillian, I think it's also important to think about the curatorial aspect of it, thinking about what does this mean for us today when we're trying to, I'm saying it in Zulu in my head, but I'm trying to translate it. How do we begin to mediate and change such structures that begin to speak to not only the current, but rethinking and reworking what that kind of is? Yeah.
I
Yeah,
guess.
I hope I'm making sense, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's like interrogating and questioning singular narrative
Correct.
and ways of doing things.
Correct.
And not necessarily taking information as is,
Right.
but also allowing your interpretation of that information was the contemporary, which also makes me think of something that Mark Seeley, who is a critical photography writer, curator, who speaks to this idea of time and the archive. Because I'd like to think of older artworks as an archive of some sort, because they speak to the artist's time and how they interpret time. And he speaks to how archives, well, he was referencing in particular like photographic archives. So how archives, or rather the reading of archives, is constantly shifting because our present is constantly changing. How you read a photograph in 2009 is very different to how you would read a photograph in 2025. Because in the present, contemporary experiences, your life experiences, what has happened, you know, like, for instance, had I read the artwork you are speaking to, Education Unrest, which is in the classroom space. Yes, curated by Puleng. And had I read that before Fees Must Fall, you know, or seen the artwork before Fees Must Fall, I don't necessarily think it would have as much weight. But thinking of the given title of A Never-Ending Story, thinking of Fees Must Fall, and also thinking of what's currently happening as well, like students are still protesting for similar things, then it allows a more weighted reading, you know, into the work. I'm just going to ask Stephen one last question before we take questions from the floor. So, taking into consideration this notion of time, and also thinking about artists such as Noria Mabasa, Helen Sibidi, there's this idea of, I'd say, spatial geographies, but also space and time. And it affects our reading, the way artists make works, because the time of, you know, these artists when they were young and making, there was a certain way of making. And looking now, I would say printmaking, for one, is becoming quite a prevalent medium of making, which is becoming very or rather, maybe more accessible for artists, but it is becoming a more prevalent medium. And I would like you to just, you know, unpack and speak to these structures and practices and ways of making, and particularly to Noria Mabasa being a woman and working with the medium of wood.
You know, the union buildings, I don't know if you know, I mean, you all know it, you see it every day of your lives. You know what the design concept was there with the two wings. Why does it have two wings? The one wing is for the English and the other is for the Afrikaners. It was the union at that point. That was the union. So when Black South Africans emerge post-94, now they want to put the women's monument in the middle between the English and the Afrikaans buildings. There's the monument, bang in the building. So seeing this monument in the actual space where the confrontation happened is absolutely critical, you know. So even the fact that they then put the memorial at Mark Square in town doesn't make sense. So what happened to us in 2000 when we were coming to put the monument in the Union buildings, simultaneously the Department of Public Works was putting a fence around the whole of the Union buildings because it was now a key point and they had to protect it. This is 2000, 5 years after democracy. The first thing they're doing is spending hundreds of millions of rand putting a fence around the property to keep people out. So it was never going to be possible for that issue around temporality and place to cohere so that you stand in the place. You know, I always used to say to the officials in the city of Johannesburg, we used to stand outside Morris Isaacson School where the 1976 student march happened. And I used to say to them, the only witness to that event are the trees on the street. Don't cut these trees down. These trees were here when that march happened. You know, so the significance of place is absolutely fundamental to making a monument and making a memorial. Can't just happen anywhere. Needs to happen in a very, very particular place. And then just the last thing around, you know, this thing of misnaming. So, you know what an ethnographic museum is, okay? So where all the tribal material and historical material, we used to have, in Cape Town, you still have it. You have these very separate museums, a museum for art, museum for science, the museum for ethnography. And in the ethnography museum is culture, and it's mostly tribal black culture. Often the misnaming, as we know, happens because everything was described as Zulu, particularly when the stuff left South Africa and went to other museums. It would be titled as Zulu. It might have been Shangaan, might have been Pedi, it could have been any number of things. But, you know, people who were gathering that information didn't have accurate records. And the it's shocking that we still don't have accurate records, because I think what happened here is the officials in the Department of Arts and Culture who took over after I left never looked through the records and didn't know that there was, because you can't get into the Union buildings. I was only there because I was a senior enough official and I had to go and report to the presidency. So I saw the stuff there, including South Africa House in London, where there's an extraordinary art collection. If any of you want to do an interesting PhD, try and get into South Africa House in London to look at the collection there. It has a fantastic story, but you can't get into these places, so you can never get to see these artworks. So the lack of historic memory amongst the officials, that they don't know that there's I don't think they know. I tried to get a photograph from them. I couldn't get a photograph from the department. And I know the officials, they probably didn't know that Noria had a women's monument in the Union buildings. So the officials went and commissioned a new piece from her. Now, the other thing about place and time, when you see this sculpture outside Noria's studio in her home in Limpopo, and all of the sculptors from that region, when you encounter those sculptures in those villages and in those rural communities, you have a totally different experience to when you see those sculptures transported to Johannesburg to a white cube gallery or put into a museum. And for me, the sculptures die in the process of translocation. Because when you are in Limpopo, now I haven't been there for a while, a lot of the spiritual beliefs and a lot of the interest in magic and a lot of the relationships, the social relationships, etc., the embodied lived experience in those villages, it is totally different to the cities. And so to move this material to these kind of synthetic environments then requires the educator, the communicator, to enable us to really interrogate and really understand what is at work deep in the power of the work. But I would definitely recommend, if you can take, I don't know what it's like these days, but there are a lot of sculptors still working in Limpopo. And when you go to their studios and visit their studios, you'll come back and this kind of work will speak to you in a very, very different way. So journey out there. The best way to learn about art is to go to artist studios. That's the best way to do it. Galleries and museums are nice, but that's where you really find out about it.
So I'm very curious. What is the name of the Warren Commission at the time?
What was the name?
Of the commission from Mabasa? Because it's clearly not Union Building.
Yeah, look, I mean, the commission, and we can find the documentation, but it was for the production of a woman's monument to be placed at the Union buildings. That was the call, that was the commission. And we identified the site, so it's the staircase up to the central podium. It's where the inauguration of the president happens, in that area. And with a little bit of information attached about the Women's March. That's how the commission was addressed. Yeah.
I would differ a bit in that regarding the monument, you know, the Gillian Fleischmann monument, which is next to the, or around the State Theatre precinct, in that while the march, well, that was the destination in the Union building, but I would think that we should also be thinking about everything else that took place towards the destination. So I'm not sure what the route was towards the Union buildings, but they might have stopped there, or they might have passed. But it was also an attempt to say what is at the Union building that's supposed to be public. People do not have access to it. So the Union building, the monument was taken out of the Union building, which is very exclusive, and it was put where the public would easier be able to access it. And it's really unfortunate that then politics and party politics then came into the whole thing, where, you know, states' monies, huge amounts, hundreds of thousands, are being spent just on maintaining something that is at this point not in use, because the public is not accessing it. We are not getting to interact and engage with the stories that are in there. And you might find that, and Gillian, when you're referring to this multiple stories that which we constantly need to interrogate, we do not know what's in there. When I went to visit the monument last year, I was told that it will open in November last year, and it's still open. It's still not. But I also want to touch on Puleng when you mentioned the incorrect labeling or titling of works. Yes, in a museum you deal with that a lot, but you also deal with the issues of language, because Noria might want to name this in Tshivenda, and then because we want to be more exclusive, but in a way then we then exclude others because we use the language that which they do not necessarily understand but cannot relate to. I'm also curious about the artwork that is in the textbooks because I've not seen it, and I'm wondering if it's not the other Noria Mabasa artwork that it's not the one that we have at Tito, because there's the other one with that speaks to the Women's March with drums, and she's used drums to represent women's voices and how as a march the drum would then amplify their voices. So I'm wondering what it is. And Sandra writes about this in an article that she published in 2017 when initially that article speaks about the monograph that was written about Noria Mabasa without speaking to her. And subsequent to that, obviously, she was not happy that someone else was speaking on her behalf. I mean, she's still alive, but they decided someone else was speaking on her behalf. And 𝗏𝗏 has named this artwork as Women of 1956. So that's what it's called. And she's interacted with Noria on many occasions. So she calls it, and that's what she says, Noria calls it, it's Women of 1956. So hopefully, and I hope through this, collaboratively we'll continue even post the We the People and interrogate the story and meet Noria as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions?